welcome to the next section of 1 Corinthians. So we're going to look at chapters 5 to 6 today, and or in this particular time in which you're looking at these videos. These are some of the more troubling passages in 1 Corinthians. I can almost guarantee you haven't heard any, if not many, sermons preached from these two chapters for a really obvious reason that they're really troubling. It's some pretty hardcore stuff that Paul is saying here and suggesting, and certainly the behavior of some of these Christians is pretty abysmal. So we're going to look particularly at the context of what was going on that was informing these behaviors, and then hopefully shed some good application light onto how we might apply that. Because one of the beautiful things about Corinthians is that every part of it has application. Even if you don't realize it, it has some very profound application to our 21st century Western church. And so I think, again, looking at these two chapters more closely will be very, very revealing. But anyway, if you remember the very, very first video that we looked at, I talked about the value of community in the ancient world. And so I've sort of repeated that a little bit throughout. If you want to get the recap, go back to the very first video and I'll talk about it there. But what was really important to understand in the ancient world is that you understood yourself in the terms of community. It was never about the individual. It was always about the group to which you belonged. And so you have a responsibility to your group. Your job, your responsibility as a member of that group is to maintain the honor of the group. Whilst ever the group is an honorable group, you have honor by being associated with that group, and vice versa. So maintaining the honor of the group is absolutely paramount to the group itself, but also to your position within that group. Your responsibility is to uphold the values of the group. And so whatever values, whatever beliefs that the group held, you had to share those values. It wasn't a collection of individuals with all different ideas and persuasions. It was people of like mind, people of the same shared opinion that made up these groups. So therefore, any sort of divisive, factional behavior was just forbidden. It was just, there was no place for that. In fact, if you looked at all examples of ostracism in the Greek cities, particularly Athens, or any exile that took place in the Roman world, the reason for you being exiled always came back to your behavior as being a threat to the harmony of the city. That was it. You could be a murderer, you could be a rapist, you could be commit any sort of violation, and you wouldn't be exiled in the way that you would be if you were doing something that was a threat to the harmony or a threat to the authorities of the particular city. So it was a really central area, it was a very central practice that took place in any given community, right from the Roman Empire right down to the smallest voluntary associations. Everybody had that same practice. So this sort of punishment was commonly understood. It wasn't obviously practiced every single day, but it was what you would expect would happen if your behavior, or if you behaved in a way that diminished the values of the group. That's something important to understand, because we live in a very different world. We don't have exile as a punishment anymore. In a sense, if you put somebody in prison, you are exiling them from the community, but it's of a different sort of nature. We don't say to somebody in Australia, well, you've committed a crime, so go to New Zealand or something, or go to Europe and never come back. That's not a punishment. We don't do that. It's different in the ancient cities, where if you're excommunicated from the city, you're cut off from your family, you're cut off from your livelihood, you're cut off from any means of support, and ultimately you're shamed. In the Roman world, if you were exiled from a city, you were cut off from all of your means of support, but anyone who found you was forbidden to give you fire and water. Fire and being where we get heat and light and a source of energy from, and water, of course, being what sustains life. You were cut off from those things. So in other words, you had to fully fend for yourself. And so exile was as good as death. It was a significant punishment, easier than killing you. We just exile you and you left to fend for yourself. And if you survive, well done. But you're not a threat to us anymore. So to remove somebody from the community, the point I'm trying to make, was a very commonly understood thing. With that came a lot of shame, and with that came a serious punishment for the individual. It's important for us to understand that, because now we come to a passage where Paul explicitly commands somebody to be exiled or excommunicated from the church. Now, this is really troubling for us, because we don't really know what to do with this. I think the practice of excommunication is probably unusual in churches because of the difficulty of it. And there's lots of applications we can talk about later on. But it's a difficult one for us to come to because we have such a greater sense of the individual that to excommunicate somebody is to, victimize them or to treat them poorly and in some cases potentially to set us up for a lawsuit. We have such a different concept of the individual in relation to the group. And so we have to take our 21st century mind off and come back into a first century mindset to fully appreciate what Paul's doing here. But in doing that, we realize that there's something very significant that still speaks to us today, and particularly within our churches. So let's just read the passage and we'll come back in the next video and we'll start to unpack it. As Paul says in chapter 5, it's actually reported that there is sexual immorality amongst you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even amongst pagans. For a man has his father's wife, and you're arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from amongst you. For though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present, with the power of the Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. What do you do with that? Wow. I mean, this is one of those passages you just wish Paul didn't put in there because it's in the Bible, so we've got to do something with it. We either ignore it, we can misapply it, or we can better understand it and recognize the significant value in what Paul, or the principle certainly that Paul is setting up in this particular passage. Welcome back. So, we're looking at one of the more difficult passages of 1 Corinthians, one that we probably wish Paul didn't put in there. We'd rather just ignore it, but since it's here, we better deal with it. And I think we'll find actually quite a profound principle that we derive from it. So let's break the passage down, let's look at it nice and slowly and actually put it back into the context of first century Corinth, and let's see where we end up. So in verse 1 he says, it's actually reported that there is sexual immorality amongst you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even amongst pagans. For a man has, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is having his father's wife. So it's a significant area of sexual immorality. So much so that Paul actually says that even the pagans wouldn't tolerate it. And you go, what kind of weird sexual stuff are these Corinthians into? Like, these guys must be absolute perverts. Well, not necessarily. I mean, they were, don't get me wrong, they were sexual just like any other Corinthian was sexual, but it wasn't anything that you wouldn't see anywhere else. But there's obviously something quite significant about this particular immorality that Paul's talking about. Some of the terminology is very informative for us. He says, first of all, that a man is having his father's wife. It's a present participle. It's an ongoing action that is taking place. So this have, right, euphemism. So he is having some sort of sexual relationship with his father's wife. Why doesn't he say his mother? Because it's not his mother. It's his father's wife. In other words, it's his stepmother. And you go, well, hang on a second. I thought this was a case of incest. I thought this was some sort of weird, perverted thing. No. It is a form of incest, but as legally defined in the ancient world. So he's in this ongoing sexual relationship with his stepmother. And you go, wow, okay, so that's like with a much older lady? No, not necessarily. In the ancient world, a 30-year-old is typically married to a 15-year-old. That's when you're first married. For a boy, it's 30. For a girl, it's 15. That's the normal age. Now, half of the women of the ancient world die in childbirth. The rest of them, a lot more of them would die from various illnesses that basically wiped out most of the population, but primarily women died in childbirth. At least half of them did. And so one in every two marriages would end with the wife's death, and then would have the father would remarry. So that's just run-of-the-mill in that time. So you have to imagine then a 30-year-old father or 30-year-old man has married a 15-year-old girl who's then very quickly given birth to a son, in this case, this guy here. And so now at some point, the mother of this young man has died. Now, we're not talking about older people here. This guy's probably, if he's 20, I'd be surprised. We're talking about only some sort of younger people, the one who's in this relationship. But if the father has remarried, he hasn't married somebody his age. He's remarried to somebody who is a teenager. So he might be now in his 40s, but he's remarried a teenager because the assumption will be that all of the older women are married. They're not remarried. It's not that the husbands are dying and she's remarried. So he probably has remarried a young woman who will be about the same age now as his son. So what you've got to picture now is the old man who's remarried a young girl who's the same age, probably, or around about the same age as the son, and they've entered into a sexual relationship. So this is our scenario, and it's an ongoing relationship. Now, what's really important to notice here is that he only addresses the man in the relationship. He doesn't address the father, and he doesn't address the stepmother, because presumably neither of them are part of the Christian community. Now, the other assumption we need to make about this is that he's having his father's wife, and it's a case of serious immorality. The assumption would have to be that the father is still alive. Because, well, okay, let's carry on, and I'll show you why in a moment. So why is this such a significant issue? You know, we understand an incestuous relationship as somebody that we're blood related to, a cousin, a sister, a parent, something like that. But in the Roman and the Jewish legal system, incest carried over to in-laws as well. So Leviticus 18:8 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife." Right? Not your mother, your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. Leviticus 20 says, "If a man lies with his father's wife, he's uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them." So not only is this relationship with a stepmother a serious issue, according to Leviticus, it's worthy of death. It's a very serious, very, very serious issue. And we see Deuteronomy repeating the same thing. Now you think, okay, that's the Jews. Maybe they're particularly pious. Maybe they're just, bit of a stick in the mud. Well, the Romans had exactly the same laws. Here it says in the Roman Digest, he says, "I cannot marry a woman with whom my father lived in concubinage, for she occupies to some extent the position of a stepmother. Certain authorities understand a stepmother to be the wife of the father, a daughter-in-law the wife of the son, and a stepdaughter the child of the wife by the former husband. An adopted son cannot marry the widow of his natural or adoptive father. Where his father has had several wives, he cannot marry any of them. Augustus decided that I cannot marry a woman whose mother has been betrothed to me, for she has occupied the position of my mother-in-law." So a mother by relation of marriage, so a stepmother in this case, a relationship with her is incest to the same degree as if she was a blood relative. So this isn't just, Roman morality. This is law. This is Roman law. So these sort of relationships that we're talking about here are illegal relationships. They're worthy of punishment. Now, an incestuous marriage by itself was forbidden, but the punishment for it was lenient, and only the male was punished. So this is, again, in the Roman law. In the case of males, the crime of incest, although more serious in its nature, is ordinarily treated less severely than that of adultery, provided the incest has been committed through an illegal marriage. Incest committed by means of an unlawful marriage is ordinarily excused on account of sex or age, or even after separation, if it takes place in good faith and a mistake is alleged, and the more readily if no one appears to prosecute. So in other words, what it's saying here is that if I was to be in a relationship with my stepmother and nobody wanted to do anything about it, everybody was just happy to gloss over it, it wouldn't be a problem. If somebody did want to make a deal about it, then I would be the one that would be punished. The stepmother wouldn't be. So it's a serious matter, but it's only really serious if somebody wants to press charges or if somebody wants to prosecute. Now that's in the case of just an incestuous relationship. However, if it was a case of incest and adultery, now we're talking about a whole different thing. So if adultery is committed at the same time as incest, for instance, with a stepdaughter or a daughter-in-law or a stepmother, there's a key point, the woman shall also be punished, for this will take place even where adultery was not committed. So incest in and of itself is that if I was to have a relationship with my stepmother, it becomes adultery if the stepmother is still married. Now, say, for instance, that my father has died. She's still my stepmother by virtue of the fact that she's married to my father. Any relationship with her is incestuous. by legal standard, but we can gloss over it. It's adultery in the event that the father is still alive. Now it's a very serious thing. Normally, in the case of in normal situations of adultery, after 5 years, there's a statute of limitations. After 5 years, no more charges can be pressed. But if it's adultery combined with incest, there is no statute of limitations. At any point, both parties can be brought up on charges and can be punished. So here we have an issue where Paul says that there's sexual immorality amongst you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even amongst pagans. This is a really serious crime. There's a really serious form of sexual immorality. And as we've seen, with his stepmother, it's already incest. It's already an illegal relationship, but of the kind that even the pagans wouldn't tolerate, would suggest that the father, in this case, is still alive. So it's both incest and adultery at the same time. Now, the question then becomes, why not address the father? Why not address the stepmother? Because they're not part of the community. The only person who's part of the community in this case is the young man who is engaged in this relationship. Now, normal Roman law says that if I, as a husband, find my wife in an adulterous relationship, I have a moral and legal obligation to bring her up on charges. If I fail to bring her up on charges, I'm actually charged as a pimp for allowing my wife to do this. So the father has a legal obligation to bring both the son and the stepmother up on charges. Paul doesn't ask him to do that because he's not part of the community. The only person he can address here is the young man who's is in this particular relationship. But what's really interesting about it is that Paul doesn't actually address the man. He only addresses the community of Christians around the man. Very interesting social situation that's going on here, and we'll have to pick that up in the next video. So we're looking at some pretty serious situation of incest. What we saw in the previous video was that this young man is in a relationship with his stepmother, which is a violation of Jewish law, but more importantly, a violation of Roman law. It's a very serious matter, and we would have to conclude that it's adulterous in that the father is still alive. So this is a really, really serious case of sexual immorality. It's actually now a legal case of sexual immorality. It's no longer a matter of, oh, well, you're being a bad boy and so we need to discipline you. No, you're actually presenting a threat to the community in that you're behaving in such a way that you are doing something illegal. Now, I hope you're connecting the dots here. What do you think is going to happen if the Roman authorities find out that this Corinthian community is tolerating illegal sexual behavior? How do you think that's going to play out? Do you think they're going to make a distinction, or do you think they're just going to come in with crosses? So we have to be very careful to understand the context that's going on here and to see the significance of why Paul is so animated about this particular issue. But what's really interesting is that Paul at no point addresses the man who's doing this. He doesn't say to the man, you got to stop this. He deals with that in a moment. The only people that he deals with in this situation are the Corinthians, the community to which the man is a part. What shocks Paul the most, the adultery and the incest is pretty bad, but what shocks him the most is the way that the community's responded. He actually says about them that you guys are arrogant, literally that you're puffed up with pride. literally you're boasting about this guy. And you go, hang on a second, man, these guys are messed up. Are they like, oh, well, you think your pastor's got sin. You should see what our pastor's got. He is just, wow. He defines sin. He's just awesome. Not quite what he means. When you boast about a person in the ancient world, you boast about them because they're superior to you. You boast about them because they're your patron. And you boast because you're their client. We've already established that most of these, all of these Christians are meeting in small houses, and those houses would be owned by a patron. They'd be owned by probably the leader of that particular house, or certainly the owner of the house. So, in boasting about this man, the Corinthians themselves are actually esteeming him. They're actually holding him up, and they're still paying him homage. They're still talking him up as this great person, knowing clearly that he's doing these things. And you go, why would they do that? What kind of weird Corinthian Christians are these? Well, the Corinthians are between a bit of a rock and a hard place. The majority of them are low status. And so you would think, okay, so why doesn't Paul just say to the low status Christians, take the man to court, go and bring him up on charges? Well, it's not quite so simple. The Roman courts were only really designed for the elite. In fact, if I, as a low-status person, was to bring a high-status person to court, I could actually be charged. Even if that person's murdered my kid, I could actually be brought up on charges for presuming to bring a high-status person to court in the first place. So Paul knows that the court systems are just not going to cut it. These impoverished Corinthians have no way of being able to bring him up on charges. The only thing that they have at their disposal is the ability to remove him from the community at all, or full stop. And so that's what Paul starts moving towards. He's saying, can't you see what's going on here? Can't you see what's happening by allowing this man, not only just allowing him to stay in your community, but to actually boast about him? This is really serious stuff. What I would have expected from you was completely the opposite response, which is this: ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from amongst you. Delivered this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Don't boast about this guy. Get the guy out. Get rid of him. They go, oh, well, why can't you just ask him to get him to repent? Well, that's clearly not going to work. Because if you're in this sort of illegal relationship, that's not just a danger to yourself, but a danger to all of the people that you're associated with, you're not a Christian. You're flat out not a Christian. You cannot, on the one hand, say, I serve and worship Jesus Christ, and at the same time, in an illegal, immoral, sexual relationship that actually brings a threat to the people that are with me. You can't be both of those things at the same time. Clearly, this man is not a Christian. Or to simply say to him, hey, dude, you got to repent. Well, you're not going to be able to do that because it's low-status people saying to their patron, hey, man, you got to change your behavior. He's going to say, well, hey, you know what, go find somewhere else to meet. It's just not going to happen. The only thing they have at their power is to say, you got to get out of here. We cannot be associated with you anymore. Paul actually uses this term here, hand a man over to Satan. You go, wow, that's pretty extreme. Like, is that a ministry that we have at church that, somebody misbehaves and there's the Satan ministry? Or we go, okay, there's the back door, Satan's waiting, go start doing church with him. Like, is that kind of what we're saying? Well, maybe not, hopefully not. But it's not the first time he talks about this. 1 Timothy 1:19 says, by rejecting this, some have made a shipwreck of their faith. Among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. Job 1 and 2 talks about Job being given over to Satan, to be tested by Satan, in order to reveal to Job what it is, this area of pride that he needs to deal with. 2 Corinthians 12:7 talks about Paul himself having a messenger of Satan attached to him, Paul allowing Satan to torment him. Luke 22:31 talks to Peter. Jesus says to Peter, Simon, Simon, listen, Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I've prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. Notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, oh, I prayed to God that Satan wouldn't be able to come near you. He said, oh no, he's coming for you, and we're going to let him. What I'm praying for is you get through it. Oh, gee, thanks, Jesus. I thought you were my protector. Well, yeah, but you know what? I'm also trying to help you to grow up, little boy. And you, once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. So a situation in which God allows us to be removed if that's the only way in which he sees us to have to learn the lesson that we need to learn. Peter went through it, Paul went through it, these other guys went through it. Paul's point is quite clear. This man is not a Christian. And to simply say to him, oh, you need to repent, okay, yes, Jesus, I'm sorry, but nothing changes. No. You've got to understand, you can't take this grace for granted. There comes a point where your behavior warrants you being excommunicated. In other words, it's not even that they're really removing him. It's actually that they're revealing to him where he already is, because he's not in the community. He's not part of the Christian community, otherwise he wouldn't be doing this. He already is with Satan. He already is an accomplice with Satan. It's only to say to him, just take note of where you actually are. Give him over to where he actually already is. But there's a purpose to it. Ultimately, what Paul wants is to move towards his salvation. He says, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Well, there's a whole list of scriptures that I've given you there, which all talk about us dying. What's the point of that? It's, being crucified, crucifying the flesh. What's that all about? It's about our salvation. It's about dying to ourselves. What this man has to realize is that first, you can't take the grace of God for granted. But secondly, you need to go through a process of purging in order to realize that, God takes this thing very seriously. He wants to save you, but you're not being saved on these terms. And so this is what Paul is ultimately intending. Ideally to save the individual, but more importantly, to spare the community. I'll just finish up on this one. It says, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Here's the real point. Paul says, I'm concerned for this individual. I want this person to meet with Christ. And the only way that's going to happen is for them to recognize that they can't take the grace of God for granted. That's only going to be done out there. My other concern and my other priority is for you guys as a community. Because whilst ever this man holds a position of authority, and whilst ever you look to this man as an example, or at the very least, whilst ever you cannot do anything about this man's behavior, he is going to influence you. And so, what's better? One person be removed and the sin dealt with, or that sin to be given time and opportunity to fester and to actually infect the rest of the community? So there's two pastoral concerns that are going on here, the individual as well as the community. But we'll come back in the next video and we'll talk about that community. Welcome back. So, what we're dealing with here is a man who is obviously an important person within the community, probably a patron, maybe one of the house church owners, and so a person who there isn't really much you can do against him. He owns the house, he's elite, he's superior. There's not a whole lot you can really do to stop him or to certainly to bring him up, certainly not to bring him up on charges. But he presents a number of threats. Firstly, he presents a legal threat to the Christian community, because if they're seen to be harbouring this guy, well, that's problematic because he's committing a crime. But secondly, the behaviour that he's exhibiting is really, really bad. And if it's allowed to, or if it's seen to be tolerated, then who's to say that other people aren't going to do the same thing? Or it's certainly going to give license for other people to behave in a similar way. And so there's a dual concern. There's the concern for the individual that Paul wants to see this man repent, but that's not going to happen whilst ever he's in the community. And there's the greater concern, which is the community itself. And so the only thing that Paul really has in his arsenal, and certainly the Christians in Corinth have in their arsenal, is to be able to say to this guy, you're no longer welcome here. Fine, we're not going to have your house, or we're not going to have your resources. It's simply not worth it. It's not worth the risk of having you here in the first place. And so Paul brings all of this back to the concern of the community. And essentially, reminds them the smallest bit of leaven in a lump is going to leaven the whole lump. Everything is going to be infected by it. So we have to just get rid of that leaven to begin with. He goes on in verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Now, this is the former letter that Paul's referring to, the one that we don't have anymore. Not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, swindler. Do not even eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from amongst you. Now that last command harks back to Deuteronomy. That's the excommunication formula that we find all the way through Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But the point is quite clear. It's not our job to judge those outside, and we certainly can't. And if it was about avoiding sexual immorality, we really would have to leave this world because, well, it's obviously everywhere. But there is a place in which we can control it or certainly deal with it, and that's within the Christian community. This is a man who's not repentant, who certainly won't be repentant, and so Paul says the only way we can deal with this is to remove this guy from amongst you. And that's the responsibility now of the Corinthians to do that for the preservation of the community, for the well-being of the community as a whole. Because if you remember, what I keep saying to you, the primary and the way that you understand yourself primarily in this world is the group in which you belong to. And so if you are seen to be diminishing the values of that group, you can be expected to be excommunicated. And so Paul's shocked, really, that with that cultural understanding, the Corinthians still haven't done it. That's probably the biggest shock to him. It's not that this guy's doing it, it's that they haven't removed him, because of course that's what you should be doing. It's in Roman law, it's in Jewish law. Why haven't you done it yet? What are you waiting for? Oh, he's an important patron. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that he gave your church some money. That's more important than the impact he's going to have on everybody else in that community? No. His instructions are quite profound. There's twofold. There's purge the evil person from amongst you, but he actually also goes to say, do not even eat with such a one. Now, this is a really significant thing that we're going to come back to in chapters 11 and 12 of Corinthians. This idea of eating with a person. In the ancient world, you eat with the people that you are in community with. That's your group. They're your people. So to sit down at a table with a group is to say, on the one hand, I am part of this group. I associate with this particular group. But at the same time, it's the group saying about you that we associate with you. You're part of that group. And so the meal is an external representation of the relationship you have with that particular group. So to not be invited to a meal or to be removed from a meal is at the same time to say you are no longer part of this community. Now, the Christian meal is obvious. It's communion. Communion is where the community comes together and acknowledges that we together are a body. And so we eat together. We share a meal together. And what that says to all of us within and to everybody outside, this is our group. If you want to be part of this meal, you need to be part of this group. It's not something you can just take flippantly. This is a very significant thing in which you participate. And so what Paul is making very clear is that this person cannot even eat at the table. A very clear command for this person to be removed from the Christian community there. So it's quite a serious situation that Paul has dealt with, and I think it has a lot to speak to us in our own modern context, in our own pastoral ministries. But we'll come back to that in the next video. We'll bring about an application. See you in a moment. So that was one of the more difficult verses in Corinthians, and I think it's probably been one of the more challenging ones for anyone that's in ministry. And I think it's also one of the ones that's probably been misapplied at least once or twice. Maybe this has happened to you, maybe you've seen this happen in ministry where you've got a young couple who have had sex before marriage. And so we have a verse that says, sexual morality, hand them over to Satan, because clearly a young couple that has sex are obviously of the devil and they need to be given back to their God. Or, we can be certainly abused. Is that what Paul is referring to? Well, clearly not. Yeah, in fact, he has something far more serious in mind. So we've got a guy who's a patron in the church, somebody who's a person of means, a person of significance, certainly a person for whom the church is dependent upon. Someone who gives money, someone who gives resources, who at the same time is not just in a sexual relationship, but of an illegal kind, one that actually threatens the legal standing of the Christian community. This is a dangerous person whose behaviour could bring repercussions from the Roman authorities. What are we talking about in the modern context? Well, if you haven't put the pieces together, we're talking about the person who gives huge amounts of money to the church, who is actively abusing children, who is actively a pedophile, or in some sort of criminal sexual behaviour. And so it's the situation where we're torn and we're saying, oh, well, they're a good giver to the church, so maybe we can gloss over these other little indiscretions that this person... See, often this passage, well, maybe not often, but certainly it could be used to deal with somebody who we just don't like, somebody who's just a bit of a pain in the butt, somebody who's just would rather get rid of. Oh, we've got a verse. It's not what Paul's talking about. He's talking about the person who actually is making some contribution, somebody who is... that we would hold up to be somebody of value, at least in a monetary sense, who we're going to work a lot harder to try to hold on to. Now, the difference between Paul's world and our world is that in that world, the poorer Christians had no legal standing. They had no ability to take this guy to court. In fact, they actually risked their own lives, in a sense, by doing that at all. The only thing they could do is to deal with this guy by excommunicating him. That's just not the case anymore. That's not the world that we live in. I remember we had a young girl in our church when I was a youth pastor who she came to one of our youth leaders and she said, I've been in this sexual relationship with my karate instructor for 12 months, whatever it was. Now she was 13 and this guy was like 30 years old, right? It was really bad. Now this karate instructor, he had no relationship whatsoever to do with the church at all, but she confided in this youth leader, and she said to this youth leader, "Oh, look, can you keep a secret?" "Oh, okay, yeah, I guess," which was the first mistake. It depends on what the secret is. But anyway, so it was a while before she actually came and told us as the leaders and the leadership team of the church what was going on. And so naturally we had to act on it, and we did act on it immediately. We got the police involved, and now we had this guy had nothing to do with our church. It was just the fact that we didn't report it immediately, we were automatically brought under suspicion. So I had to go sit down with the local detective. All of the leadership team had to go and sit down with these detectives and basically give a justification for why we didn't deal with this thing straight away. Had we been seen to do anything illegal, well, that would have brought all sorts of legal repercussions on the church. And this guy had nothing to do with the church, much more about a person who's actually involved in the church itself. And so there are a lot of legal implications that are taking place here. And that's the severity of the sort of situation that we're dealing with. And so for Paul, they've got to deal with this. In the same way, we need to recognise the significance of some of these behaviours. And it doesn't matter if this person completely funds the entire church. That sort of behaviour cannot be tolerated for the safety of the community. And here's the bigger picture that Paul has, because remember, they think in terms of community. We often think in terms of the individual, and, at a secondary thought, maybe think about the community. For Paul, it's the other way around. For him, the community is absolutely priority. And so here we've got a guy who's a threat to the community. Well, we've got to protect the sheep. I mean, Paul sees himself as a shepherd. Jesus presents himself as a shepherd. He's concerned about the one sheep, and he's also concerned about the other 99 as well. That entire thing is his priority. And so it speaks to the situation of the person who is in an illegal sexual situation. But what about a person who is just a bit of a player? What about a young man? We'll use the man as an example because often that's the case that we find. What about the guy who's coming into a youth group and is just sleeping around with the girls? Now, outside of the church context, there's no crime there. He's not doing anything illegal. You know, no. If every bloke got arrested for sleeping around with more than one woman that wasn't his wife, pretty much every bloke on the planet would be in jail. So there's nothing illegal about that behaviour. But how do you deal with that? You know, is Paul? Are we referring now to the young couple who are in a consensual relationship and ongoing, and are we dealing with something completely different? Are we talking about a person who's coming in and systematically abusing the relationships that he has? There's no sense of him wanting to serve Christ. He's just there to pick up girls and to sleep with girls. What do you do with that? Well, do you just ask them to repent? Well, perhaps. But what if they're completely unrepentant? Well, Paul would say, hand this person over to Satan. Oh, well, that doesn't seem very fair. Well, they're not a Christian. They're obviously not a Christian. If they're coming to a church just to pick up girls or to indulge in sexual immorality, they're not a Christian. They're certainly not being there's no evidence of them being transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. They're just there to abuse people in the group. So what's more important, to protect, to help this young person, to disciple them, or to protect the rest of the group that's been threatened by this person's very presence? And so in that sense, there is a significant pastoral concern that takes place here. Let's take sexuality out of the issue altogether. That's just something, that's quite an obvious one, somebody who's just trying to abuse the people in the congregation sexually. What about somebody who's just coming into just to make business connections? What about somebody who's just coming in to sign up clients? What about somebody who's coming in to use a gathered community for their own personal ends? What do you do with that person? Well, that's where it really starts to get a little bit tricky, but that's something we have to be aware of, because we have a responsibility to the individual as much as we have a responsibility to the community. And our first priority to the community is to build the body of Christ, is to build a body that together glorifies Christ and brings about his kingdom. Everything else is secondary to that. The question becomes, when that secondary thing takes over and actually starts to impede the work of the spread of the kingdom. Or worse still, people are actually being used in the community for other ends other than the gospel of Jesus Christ. So there's a challenge in this. There's a significant challenge in this. And there are days when I thank God that I'm not pastoring anymore, because, boy, some of these can be tough ones to work with. But yeah, I'll leave that with you to ponder. Well, the fun continues. So that last one was quite a challenging pastoral issue, and look, it's not any different with chapter 6. So let's launch in. So we'll read the whole passage, and then we can come back and we can break it down verse by verse. Paul says, when one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more then matters pertaining to this life? So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one amongst you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded, that you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers? So, here we've got a case of Corinthians going to court with Corinthians. Now, we have a context for this, lawsuits and this sort of thing, and that's basically what Paul's talking about, but he seems to give some unusual instruction about that. So let's just very quickly analyze what the situation might be. So if you're looking at the diagram there of Corinth, if you remember the bema seat, the seat of judgment, if you see it there just in the forum, just at the at the bottom part, you've got bema and there's a square there. That's the seat of judgment. That's where court is held. Now the thing about ancient court is that it was a public affair. You go to court, you take somebody to court, and it's done in front of the entire city. The jury are made up of elite men within the community, but it's a public event. Everybody turns out to see the latest criminal proceedings. And so in Corinth, when Christians are going to court with Christians, that's exactly where it's taken place. Now, we established in the previous video that a low-status person could never take a high-status person to court. In fact, a low-status person couldn't even afford to go to court in the first place. So if two Christians are going to court with each other, then that would be two of the wealthier people within the church. So we've already seen the sort of divisive behaviour that's going on in Corinth. It wouldn't be a shock for us to imagine that they might be going to court with each other. But specifically, what is this court situation about? Paul refers to it as a grievance against another. He talks about trivial cases. He talks about matters pertaining to this life. He talks about a dispute between brothers. He mentions lawsuits, and he talks about you yourselves wrong and defraud. In the Roman court system, you have two different types of court, not unlike today. You've got the civil court and you've got criminal court. The civil court is where you deal with lawsuits, it's where you deal with property issues or disputes, this sort of thing. The language that Paul is using here makes it very clear that what we're talking about here is a civil dispute. It's not a criminal thing. It's not that, somebody's been murdered or somebody's been stealing. We're talking about some sort of civil dispute, some sort of lawsuit, which is, as Paul says, trivial. It's not really a serious matter. That's really interesting because the way that the courts were used was often as a form of gaining status. If I'm an elite person in the city, I've got a certain amount of honour and status within the city, and I see that there's somebody else in the city who's maybe getting a bit higher than me, somebody's getting a bit more honour than me, somebody who's, getting a bit more of a reputation. There are different ways that I can cut them down a peg or two, but one of the best and most effective ways that I can do that is just to take them to court. Even if I don't have any actual charges, I can still bring them up on charges anyway. Even if it doesn't stick, it's the fact that I have publicly brought them before the courts, and now there's an air of suspicion about that person. Now, we still see this today, don't we? You see somebody who's been accused of some sort of horrible crime, and then later on it's turned out they were actually completely innocent. But there's always that question from then on about the person. Yeah, you know what? I know they were found innocent, but I reckon they were actually guilty. Even if they're absolutely innocent, their name has been dragged through the mud. The damage is done. That's all we need to do. We don't even need to prove it. We just need to publicly shame them. Now, that was a very common practice. That was just like a regular usage of the courts. It was just a way of publicly slandering somebody else in the community. Now, that's just what Corinthians do. That's what Romans do. That's what Greeks do. That's just the way that world works. And so it's very easy to imagine. Here we've got quarrelsome Corinthians who are elite, who have the ability to go and access these courts, who are disputing over I follow Paul or I follow Apollos or any other number of things that they're disputing over. It would be very easy to imagine that these two very proud, very arrogant Corinthians are taking each other to court to let the public deal with it, to let those outside of the Christian community deal with it. Paul says to them, can it be that there is no one amongst you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? The answer is yes. If you've been educated, you've actually been trained in law. To be an orator is to actually be a lawyer.